Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt. And today we're really thrilled to be joined by Professor Frank Furedi, sociologist, author, director of MCC Brussels, and one of those kind of public intellectuals who I think life would be so much less rich without. Your latest book, Frank, we're going to talk about is In Defence of Populism, which I have in my hand. I confess I haven't actually had time to read it yet. I do think you write books quicker than I can read them, which is which is tricky. But I think you've written a couple of articles on this, so I think we can talk about some of the themes of it, even though we have to confess we've not got all the way through it yet.
And perhaps you can just start off by telling us what motivated you to write this book. I know you did a Substack article, which we'll link to, but perhaps you can just start by that.
Well, what happened was I noticed that almost everything that you read about populism or hear about populism in the media is communicated through the voices of people that hate populism. And it's almost as if the very term populism has become an invention of people who don't like the populists. So there's a kind of anti-populist sentiment. And they get to decide what populism means in everyday life. They are the ones that define what populism is. And what's interesting about populism is that when you think about it, almost nobody describes themselves as populist. It's not a term of self-description. Instead, populist is used as a kind of a pathologizing term, as a kind of swear word, so that it becomes almost like the moral equivalent of being far right or being fascist. That's really how it's used in general. It always comes with a health warning. And I wanted to basically take up the challenge of almost reinventing and reinterpreting what populism is, both by looking at it historically, but also what is it that these people who are attacking populism are targeting. And that's how the whole idea for the book began, because I wanted to almost rescue populism from the language of its political detractors.
So that you've immediately introduced something that I find quite confusing, which is why is populism always, I know left and right, tricky concepts to think about these days, but why is populism always right-wing? Why are there no left-wing populists?
Well, historically, there were a lot of left-wing populists. There are different kind of movements, from all the way from the Narodniks in Russia to the different movements of trade unionists and workers in the United States, the IWW, and all the way to the interwar period and into the 50s. They were always left-wing populists. In the modern era, in our era, the reason why populism tends to be associated with the right rather than the left is because left-wing populists like Podemos in Spain or the Five Star Movement in Italy tend to focus almost entirely on economic issues, tend to focus entirely on people's economic, social circumstances, whereas national populists tend to focus on people's cultural predicament, particularly on people's aspiration for a home and for a voice. And it seems to me that what has happened is that because most people are so culturally insecure that they've often struggled to find their voice, they find in national populism a potential answer to some of their problems, whereas the so-called left-wing populists do not address those questions that actually preoccupy a lot of people, millions of people throughout Europe, who feel that for some reason they're not represented, that feel that for some reason their voices is in many respects disrespected. And that's why I think there is this absence of left-wing populists. So most left-wing populists don't last very long because they don't really address the key questions facing people.
And do we think, where does Zach Polanski fit in all this? Because he likes to say he is a populist, doesn't he?
Well, a few people say they're populists. They call Andy Burnham a populist. But to be honest, I don't find them to be popular. One of the defining features of populism for me is that they very often challenge not just the elite, but elite values, the basic values that dominate our society. Whereas someone like Polanski is very much expresses a version of elite values. And that's why you'll often find that the Greens are treated very differently than, let's say, Reform or anybody else that's on the right wing who are seen as the enemy. But the Greens are seen as these nice, cuddly environmentalist people that are, maybe a bit misguided, but they're essentially on our side.
But Zach Polanski sort of speaks out against the the millionaires and the billionaires, and it feels to me like it's very similar to Bernie Sanders 2016, where he knows who he's projecting as the enemy, and that seems to me more of an elite, if you like, than perhaps what Reform are projecting as the enemy. And it doesn't seem to be as clear cut with Reform. And I think a lot of Zach Polanski would probably argue that Reform are going after immigrants who are not the elite of the country, whereas the Greens are going after the elite. Are the Greens not the real populists?
No, because the Greens actually share the values of the elites. For example, if you take one of the most important underpinnings of elite values, it's to do with environmentalism. It's the obsession, with net zero and related matters. They're probably the main ideologically influential elements within elite thought at the moment. If you look at, for example, the Greens, they really brought into the identity politics, which are promoted feverishly by both the Tories and by Labour and by the legacy media. So when you actually scratch the surface, in terms of its value orientation, in terms of its fundamental, ideas about norms, the Greens really represent an element of a continuity with the outlook of the political classes, and I see them as part and parcel of that.
So your organisation, MCC, is based in Brussels and Budapest, and I don't know if this is. It occurred to me when we were thinking about interviewing you that seems like the sort of the two polar opposites in recent years. Brussels representing the technocratic establishment, and Budapest, certainly until Orban was defeated recently, representing maybe a slightly more populist element. Do we think that Orban's replacement is very much unlike Orban, and is he an anti-populist? The new it's Peter Magyar, isn't it, the new leader of Hungary?
I don't think either one of them were populist. I think that I think you got to make a distinction between the spirit of populism that envelops a society and the politicians that are associated with it. So almost everybody that's associated with populist politics, it really isn't. So Orban has always claimed to be a Christian Democrat, and his politics are very much in the same ballpark as someone like Konrad Adenauer in Germany, or Charles de Gaulle. So although he did things that might have been popular at one point, or what is associated with some of the populist movement, he himself never described himself as populist, and his focus was always on mobilizing the middle classes. He was very honest about it, that he wanted a strong Hungarian middle class that would be the backbone of Hungarian society. Peter Magyar is a typical technocrat, and his politics is really a technocratic managerialism that in our country, in Britain, was best personified by someone like Tony Blair. I think that Magyar would have been very comfortable in a Tony Blair cabinet in terms of his particular outlook.
So I think he said that he's going to fly economy and take a pay cut in his salary. I think these are quite often things that pop up nowadays. Are these attempts just at showing that he's, this term LARPing? I don't know if Hilary's probably... Oh, you know that?
I do know that one, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Usually Hilary's not a favour of the internet slang, but LARPing, live action role playing, as populists, are these people trying to attempt to put themselves across as populists?
Yeah, it's a bit like whenever you see... How many times have you seen British politicians from the big parties sort of go into a pub and serve a pint of beer. How many times have you seen Ed Miliband, sort of bite into a hot dog or a hamburger? So they all try to demonstrate that they're the man of the people or the woman of the people. And that kind of role playing is very, very common. And I think that's more or less what Peter Magyar is doing. He's done a lot of these videos that show him. There's one recent one that was made in Berlin, where you see him, biting into this sausage sandwich in Berlin, sort of, and that was like his big TikTok contribution to his Berlin trip.
There's the election in Hungary did lead to quite a lot of people saying that this was a real kind of almost paradigm shift. Do you think that's right, or?
No, really. I mean, look, this is the government that's been in power for 16 years. It's very rare for governments to be in power for 16 years. And you do get a point at which people get fed up. They want to see a new government, a new face. And therefore, I think that it was only a matter of time before somebody else would be able to effectively challenge the government. Obviously, it's a big deal for Hungary. And it's also a big deal for the EU because the Orban government was the only serious force that stood up against their policy on mass migration, illegal migration, that stood up against the EU's Green Deal, stood up against the gender politics of Brussels. So that was all very important. But I think that the good news is that when you look at the rest of Europe, you'll find that there is a kind of a spirit of populism that's still very powerful. And therefore that surge that you've seen in recent years is still continuing.
I think if you wanted to kind of look at the other side of the coin of populism, you might call that the kind of identitarianism, mightn't you? And I know a lot of people, certainly a lot of people I know, are very optimistic that maybe we're at the end of some of that. But I know you don't think that, do you? Do you want to describe why you think maybe our celebrating the end of some of that identity politics is a bit premature?
Well, I don't think identity politics will ever be really defeated unless you build an alternative to that, unless you really challenge it at its roots. And I think what has happened is that there's been a reaction against some of its most extreme manifestation here and there. And governments have passed a few sort of laws, none of which have actually been properly implemented. But I think the reason why identity politics and that whole ideology that goes along with it, the whole cultural dynamic is still so powerful, is because the key institutions of socialization, which are principally nurseries, schools, and universities, are in the hands of people that are totally obsessed with identity-related issues. And therefore, we have a situation where new generations of young people coming through school and going into university are still educated to basically see their identity as being an all-encompassing, determining influence. And therefore, they're also very sympathetic to all the presumptions of identity politics. And you'll find that because of that, new generations are coming through who are more or less socialized into thinking that identity politics is really the most positive outlook on the world. And anybody that rejects it is somehow on the wrong side of history.
I mean, this is very much anecdotal, but I was on Saturday, I was at Parkrun protesting against Parkrun's acceptance of men in the women's category in the records for Parkrun. So I was there with a friend from the Women's Rights Network. And generally we get quite a bit of, people tutting at us and being very disapproving. And it was really interesting that we got, I think, almost none of that. But I actually think in retrospect it's because it's a new park run. It's in Urmston. Now, I know you won't know in Manchester, Frank, but Urmston is kind of a normal suburb of Manchester with normal people in it. Not one of the...
Not Didsbury.
Not Didsbury, where you've got, the students and the BBC types. It's just like really ordinary working people. Mm. And I kind of think maybe that was why we didn't get the pushback we normally do.
And I wonder if we had the local elections here, obviously, about a month ago, and Hilary and I both stood for the SDP in the local council elections. And where I am, certainly Hilary's in a different council, but where I am in Manchester, it was dominated by Green councillors. And I was there thinking to myself, this is just, Greens have had an amazing election. And then I look on the news and see, actually, no, Reform have done brilliantly. Greens have done fairly good. They're up 500 councillors or something. And I thought to myself, I wonder if that's that effect, that where I am, South Manchester, it's very liberal, metropolitan. And actually, the majority of the country is more like what you described in Urmston. And that's what we're starting to see play out electorally between these two very different visions of politics.
That's why.
Yeah, there's a very interesting research just been carried out by some people from King's College, where they basically look at the outlook and views of people who work in the public sector. And they ask all the questions. I don't know if you've seen it, but what's interesting is that their views, these people working in the public sector, is almost antithetical to the majority of ordinary people. So what we have is almost like this parallel reality where you can almost tell in advance what somebody's attitude will be towards trans ideology, what somebody's attitude will be towards, gender politics or race-related politics. And you can tell that in advance because both their class and social position is a big influence on it, but also because increasingly the kind of jobs they do, the affiliation that they have through their jobs, has got a really strong impact on it. And the public sector now, even the police, as we saw very recently, is so much educated into accepting these sentiments that their views is almost the opposite on many, many issues to that of normal human beings in the rest of society.
It seems to me that I don't know if this is something you'd agree with, but it seems like where there's that democratic deficit and where the sort of the elite and the political elite, but also just in these institutions, where they've become so out of touch with the ordinary, public in places like Urmston, it's left a gap in the market for a politician to come in and start resonating with the public. And that's what, is called populism. And then you get the mainstream media and others, I think of like Alistair Campbell's and Roy Stewart's of the world, that become very snooty about it. And rather than actually addressing the concerns of those citizens and addressing the root causes, they just kind of become very sneering of populism as a whole. I mean, you said in your Substack article about the book, you said it offers an antidote to the confusions and distortions peddled by the anti-populist ideologues. So what are those confusions and distortions? How can we, like you say there, how can we have something how can we offer a reasonable solution or what's the right
alternative?
word? An alternative.
Well, I think that one can give an alternative account. One of the ways that I try to do it is by arguing that everything that these people say about populism is fictitious, because if you look at the way that populism is defined, they almost always say that they're just anti-elitist. Being anti-elitist is their dominant, sort of sentiment. But actually, populism is not anti-elitist. They're anti-certain kinds of elites that are around. It's not like they have, this kind of obsession with elites in general, but certainly with the people, particularly the cultural elites that exist within our society. Or alternatively, they say is that populists tend to be racist, and populists tend to have this obsession with what they call the pure people. And every definition of populism talks about how populism is continually has this quest to make sure that the pure people, sort of are protected. But the reason why they do that is because when you use the term pure people, it has very strong links with what the Nazis used to argue. But if you read what the populists say about themselves, what they write, I never once saw a single reference to the pure people. That's not something that actually exists. So what I try to show is that there are certain things about populism that are its defining feature. And I think that one of them is a quest for solidarity. There's a real deep yearning to build communities through real solidarity. I talk about the fact that there's a quest for a home, that people really want to feel that this is my home, this is where I belong, this is where sort of I feel that I am who I am. I know my place in the world. There's a quest for belonging, having a kind of that kind of community sensibility where you can take things for granted and you don't have to explain yourself. There's also an element of patriotism. And the reason why patriotism is important is because unless you take the nation seriously, you cannot take democracy seriously, because democracy can only work within the boundaries of a nation. It's not something that you can support and promote abstractly on a global sort of scale. So I go on and I look at all the different elements that populism has and that people are yearning for. And there's also this incredible demand for a voice. People want to be taken seriously, and they want to have their voices heard, and that's something that is usually ignored and not understood by those people who are hostile to this. So in the whole thing, what I try to do is to kind of represent this aspiration on the part of people to take control over their lives. And what I end up concluding is that what they are really, what populism really is an attempt to give meaning to democracy. It's like democracy in action in the end. And okay, democracy is not always beautiful and pretty. It's often very messy. But when people are trying to make sense of the world and trying to develop a sense of agency, then I think on balance, that's a very positive development.
One of the things we've talked about over the past few podcasts is the kind of draining out of democracy from lots of areas of our lives. So we talked the other week, didn't we, about the fact that, Labour Party annual meetings used to be, real arguments about things like Clause 4 and all those kind of things that we all had in public. And now it feels like political parties are less democratic than they used to be. It feels like consultations at a kind of local level run by councils are less democratic than they used to be. The kind of democratic content of all that discussion seems to have kind of drained away. And we've talked about the fact that what we really want to kind of reinstitute is this idea of the national interest, but the national interest not as something you kind of get off a shelf and dust off, but something that is a public conversation. But the kind of really tricky thing about that is, how do you reinstitute and, reinvigorate those kind of public discussions and debates and that kind of the political integration of ordinary people into that discussion? How does that happen?
Well, I think it happens when ordinary people are able to participate. So the reason why this is happening with Labour and the Tories is because they lost a lot of their base. They haven't got very many people who are activists in the real sense of the term within their political parties. And therefore, almost all these arguments they have are really about personalities and about sort of narrow individual interests that take place on top of things. But when you look at the membership, they're completely passive, or alternatively, they're excluded from these kinds of discussions. And therefore, it means that even those very basic elements of democracy, which the inter-party democracy, where you would have big arguments and clashes of views within a constituency, are become much, much more weaker than was the case in the past. Then the question then becomes, what do you do? Well, I think at the moment, what we have to do is to realize that there's a demand for democratic decision making, and we can see that there's a demand for that by the fact that you have all these parties that they call populist, flourishing and surging forward, and that's demand driven. It's not because necessarily those parties have a great program or necessarily because they're unusually clever. It's just basically that there's this demand for representation. And I think it's a question of finding a way of ensuring that that demand for representation acquires a more explicit political form than is the case at the moment. And that's how democracy, sort of begins to gain meaning and acquire a very real presence in the public sphere.
I saw a thing recently of there was a graph when it took the sort of the so-called populist parties of Europe, and I know you said that you didn't think Orban was populist, but it included his party, Fidesz, as I say it, as well as Smer in Slovakia, which is Robert Fico's party, as well as Vox in Spain, AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen's party, all of these. And it was making the case that the ones that are more right-wing economically seem to do worse electorally. And I'm wondering that there seems to be a lot of these parties seem to have reached a ceiling. That's certainly how the media are claiming with reform in the UK. What do you think comes next? How will these parties adapt? Reform have obviously got a lot of internal decisions to be made about what their economic policy, how it takes shape. What do you see coming next for populism or populist parties?
Yeah, it's very difficult to predict because at a certain point, they often feel that they're confronted, particularly the politicians feel they're confronted with either you become pragmatic and you try to play the game, or you basically carry on and kind of demand certain things that are represented as unrealistic. And you got to make that kind of decision as to what the balance is, because obviously you need to be both a little bit pragmatic, but you also need to make sure that that energy and that spirit of dissent is given a political shape. And at the moment, what we have is a situation where different parties are reacting differentially depending on the national context. And you are right to say that they often reach a ceiling. So on average, increasingly, most populist parties have reached 25 to 30% of the electorate, but they haven't gone beyond. There are exceptions. In Austria, they're almost the majority. And I think in Germany, they could be fairly soon a majority. But by and large, there's this kind of limit. And therefore, the question becomes, what's the next phase? How are they going to manage to go beyond that? And it's at that point that the challenge is to find a way of developing your appeal so that you can bring in other constituencies, other types of people into your camp. But at the moment, we're in a situation where none of these questions are resolved. And ultimately, it depends upon the maturity and the professionalism of the different parties, to what extent they're serious, to what extent they can overcome the petty personality squabbles and discussions, to what extent they're able to develop policies that are coherent and mature. All these things become really important. And at that point, you will see, I think France is very interesting because in France, you can really see how Bardella and Le Pen have decided that they're going to adopt a fairly pragmatic course of action. They're trying to sort of rein back, sort of the more populist radical demands that their supporters have. In other places, I think that Portugal and in Spain, there's still that kind of harnessing of the energy in a way that is more, sort of more rebellious than is the case somewhere else. So it's very much a national thing. But I think that the danger that these movements face is that they can be easily either just kind of marginalized, which is one strategy that's used against them, or alternatively, they can easily be incorporated within the existing institutions of society, particularly on economic matters, because as Meloni discovered in Italy, when you're confronted with the global markets and economic reality, it's very difficult to know how you respond to that.
Just a little aside on plateauing of the populist vote. I do think sometimes it's like John Curtis in the UK, who's the kind of, the media guru.
My eyes are rolling back in my head already.
He's the guy that the media always turn to on polling, and he just gets everything wrong. You know, Denton Gorton said would be a 3-way split exactly. He has predicted new plateaus for reform almost every week. It's like, oh, well, this is as far as it can ever go. And then the next week, oh, this is as far as it can ever go. And I think there are a lot of commentators who are really stuck in that old politics world who keep saying things have reached a plateau, almost because that's what they hope. And I think we've just got to be a bit cynical about some of those.
Yeah, I mean,
commentators.
if you're ever lacking confidence, I think all you need to do is look at people like Andrew Marr and John Curtis, who it's actually quite impressive how consistently wrong they can be, and yet they still manage to land pretty good gigs. I do think that with the plateauing thing, there is a sense that with reform, for example, I think, well, obviously I'm in the SDP and that's where my heart lies. But I do think to myself, could I ever vote for reform? Why is it that I feel like I am not part of that project? And I think for me, it's that they get to the point where they realise in order to grow, they think they have to start taking on old establishment figures and maybe making some concessions. And you were alluding to this a little bit, Frank, with Bardella and Le Pen. And then they lose a lot of that the initial energy that the start of a populist party might have. And it seems to me that populist parties are struggling to marry those two things. The initial energy that comes from saying, you know, the political elites are out of touch, we need to send a message, and a serious programme of government. And it seems like that I can't see that there's anybody at the moment, any populist party, that are successfully marrying those two things. I mean, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about NEETs.
Yes.
Because you wrote an article about this, Frank, that Hilary shared with me. And it seems like an interesting area where you've got these sort of the old establishment response to it. So NEETs are people that are not in education, employment or training. And I think is there over 1 million now between 16 and 24, which is a staggering number. And over 1 million people in the UK between 16 and 24 are not in employment, education or training. And I love this. Well, maybe before we go into, I've taken a quote from your article. Maybe you can just give us a quick summary of what you saying in that article, Frank.
Well, I mean, basically what I'm arguing is that obviously it's a huge problem, and it's a huge problem, but it's not a problem that's merely an economic problem in the way that it's generally represented, but actually it's more of a moral problem, because one of the reasons why we have so many young people who are neither in education or employment is because they've been systematically socialized into regarding themselves as fragile, vulnerable individuals. And it's not their fault, but if you've basically been more or less medicalized by your teachers, and you've been told that every time you're facing a very difficult challenge, then that's something that you can only negotiate if somebody is holding your hand. And if you basically kind of psychologize young people's lives, then it's not surprising that you're almost incited to feel that you're weak, you're potentially fragile, you're mental health problems. And therefore, what's happened is that we've created a situation where a significant section of the younger generation have adopted this kind of very passive lifestyle, where their sense of agency has been almost taken away from them. And therefore, the result of that is that they just end up, sort of playing with their digital toys in the bedroom rather than playing a more active role within society.
Mm-hmm. I love this this quote from the article, which I've got on the screen. It says, you said, unfortunately, the report is so devoted to the goal of relieving NEETs of any responsibility for the situation they face that it goes overboard and flatters them as a resilient, talented generation that has been failed by a system designed for a world that no longer exists. It seems like this is a classic sort of trope with the sort of technocratic centrist establishment, is to always say, oh, this group, they're fully it's amazing talent and potential there, but it's the system has kind of let them down. And it's a very infantilizing approach, I find.
It is totally infantilizing. And in the report, they referred to this generation as extraordinary, when there's nothing extraordinary. I mean, we're not all extraordinary. and we don't have to be. But the way they talk about this group is entirely dishonest, because they themselves know that these are troubled people who have sort of lost control over their lives. And instead of acknowledging that, it's almost like they got to create this impression, which is completely dishonest. I mean, this is what I find very troubling: is the dishonesty that lies behind these kinds of reports. The fact that we're not facing up to the fact that we are, our society is, and our system of education and culture is directly responsible for creating this predicament in which over 1 million young people find themselves in.
I mean, that report, I think, was headed up by Alan Milburn, I want to say, who's the former health secretary under Blair.
Yeah.
It seems like there are people, especially from that time of government, and I suppose it's partly just a passage of time thing, which is that they that era of the Blair government, a lot of those people are now out of the House of Commons and heading up think tanks and such, and so we're hearing from some of them. But it does seem like there are musings that are things that kind of do speak to us. So we talked about Tony Blair's recent essay on the podcast last week, and he's saying certain things that we agree with. Mm-hmm. That's sort of quite unsettling, because you think, well, I don't like this guy and I don't agree with what he did. But then he's saying things like, net zero is not a workable policy. And what is that? Is that a sign that the technocrats are starting to listen and be reasonable, or is it something else?
Well, I think that you do have an older generation of politicians who are able to see the more grotesque manifestation of Labour policy for what it is. And I think what Blair has done is basically not provide the real critique of the existing Starmer government, but the more extreme versions of that. So their net zero policy, that Ed Miliband outlook, which is so destructive of our economic existence, is something that he's prepared to criticize. But at the same time, there are many politicians of that generation that are complicit in continuing this. So, for example, you have Gordon Brown being invited by Starmer to Downing Street recently, and who's, he's responsible for an outlook of which Starmer is the inheritor. You have someone like Andy Burnham, is a very good example. I mean, he's one of Brown's creation, sort of now coming back into the limelight, and he's kind of being represented as this big hope of Labour Party that somehow has miraculously transformed Manchester into this incredibly wonderful, dynamic place. So it's fairly mixed. But what is interesting is that given the intellectual incompetence and policymaking incompetence of this generation of Labour leaders, they're having to rely on some of the old-timers to fill the gap. Because when you look at the Labour government at the moment, they are unusually incompetent, and they're unusually thick in terms of their policy-making decisions. So it's not surprising that some of these old-timers feel that they need to at least open their mouths and say a few things.
And if we're putting ourselves into the shoes of perhaps a Labour strategist, and we're trying to help the current government, and they clearly want to make it the next election a question of Labour versus Reform, what would you advise the Labour government to do in order to win that next election?
Well, I think that the most important, the most effective thing that they can do is to try to mimic as much of Reform's policies as possible, and try to sort of come across as being less woke, more patriotic, and more able to listen to the voices of their traditional supporters. They have to win back the red wall. They can't really have any chance of succeeding unless they kind of get back those people that they've lost, and probably, hopefully, forever. But I think that's really what they have got to focus in on. In fact, at the moment, it looks like they're going to adopt an opposite strategy. They're going to try to consolidate their base of support with the people who are, the public sector professionals, the kind of southern seats where they feel that they still have a role to play. London is still fairly laborish, and that's really what they are tied to, and they haven't got the imagination to go beyond that at the moment, which is good. And that's why I think it's very interesting that they put all their eggs in one basket and imagine that someone like Andy Burnham is going to miraculously sort of solve the problems that confronts them.
I'm going to be a bit sarky and say, how can you copy Reform's policies when they haven't got any?
I knew that was coming.
They're always stealing our policies, Frank. That's why we get a bit annoyed with Reform. They don't have policy in an area, so they think, oh, we'll take that one from the SDP.
I wouldn't mind if they knew how to implement it. We've been joined by the dog. I don't know if anyone heard some growling.
I think what you're referring to there, that kind of issue for the Labour Party is to, which bit of their support do they concentrate on? That Paul Embry's called that Hartlepool versus Hampstead, hasn't he? And it does seem that they are adopting more for the Hampstead option.
I think so, because that's what they spontaneously gravitate towards. It's almost as if Labour have decided to talk to people like themselves. That's what they like. So therefore, it's almost like they're going to be looking for people like themselves, and then basically to see what else can happen. But they've lost the capacity to talk to a working class audience in a language of the working class. So for them, working people are increasingly an alien group with which they have very little in common, and whose language they don't really quite understand.
Yeah.
It does seem, though, sorry, just to go back to which direction they go in, it does seem like the people that are on the, let's say, the left, I use this in quotations, the people that are more on the sort of the green left think that Labour are going very right-wing on things like immigration, with Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary. Then the people on the right, or perhaps more the working class red wall seats, they seem to think Labour are going further left. And it does feel like Labour are kind of trapped because they're getting perceived differently. I mean, one of the things I've said is, net immigration was down, I think, to 185,000 in the latest figures. It doesn't seem like that's going to cut through to the public. The public have already got an idea that Labour are high immigration. And it seems like even if, what I would advise them to do is probably quite similar to you, I think, Frank, which is, focus on those areas you've lost, the rebel seats, the working class areas. However, I feel like if they do that, they're perhaps just completely die as a party. And perhaps the way to kind of consolidate and just limit your losses is to recognise that you are now just a metropolitan sort of liberal party, and to maintain those seats in London.
I don't know. That cannot be a conscious strategy, because that would mean that Labour becomes what the Lib Dems used to be. Sort of this third minority part or fourth minority party, which, given its historical role, I think they would find difficult to accept. But of course, we're not talking in such a way that we kind of projecting to the future some of the patterns of the past, whereas politics is changing very, very, very rapidly, and all the parties are unraveling. So the dynamic in terms of party politics that we're moving into, that's taking us forward, is inherently corrosive of the old dynamic. And that's what's so interesting about it, because we're now moving into a genuine multi-party system, where it's no longer the case that you necessarily are going to have one party that is going to get a majority to be able to run the country, and you're going to have potentially a regime of coalitions that we kind of, along the continental lines that we're moving into. So we just got to keep our eyes open and see, sort of which way the wind is blowing, and try to learn from the patterns that are gradually crystallizing in front of our eyes, but have not yet acquired that kind of rigid, tangible form that it will do in a few years' time.
Shall we just finish off on neats? Because I think we maybe left that hanging because we went off on a bit of a tangent on Alan Milburn, I think. So just to go back to that thesis, Frank, that you were saying, this is a moral problem. It's not just a kind of problem around the right jobs don't exist. It's actually, a problem with the kind of generation that we've created. I mean, are there any solutions to that? How do we tackle that?
Well, the only solution is to alter the way we educate young people. I think we need a new curriculum and the adoption of a pedagogy that's much more focused on challenging young people rather than flattering them. I think that we've got to somehow have the confidence in ourselves to basically educate people instead of trying to play with them. I mean, which is what is often the case. And a kind of regime where we're stretching young people as far as we can, so that, in a sense, we're educating them for independence, educating them to stand on their 2 feet, and giving them the possibility of having a glimmer of what real agency is at that early stage. So that requires a radical rethinking of the socialization process. And that goes not just simply for schooling, but also for parenting, the way we rear children. And finally, also, the universities are a huge problem in that respect, because they've become almost like a finishing school for medicalizing people. That's the role they're playing at the moment.
That might be the title of the episode, A Finishing School for Medicalising People. Good. Okay. Are you happy with neats?
Very. Well, yes. No, I'm not happy.
Not happy, but
no,
yeah,
but I'm happy with Frank's.
We've explored it.
Yeah.
So, I'm conscious of time. Shall we finish off with
Let's do
Culture Club?
Culture Club, yeah.
So I had something to bring, so maybe I should go first and then see if anybody else has anything to throw into the ring. So I watched on BBC 4, this is the TV BBC 4, not the radio, The Count of Monte Cristo. Have you read it?
I've not. I'd very much liked it. So it's on my list.
Have you read it, Frank?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So, it's a great story. It's full of all the, the worst and best of human emotions, and the whole kind of revenge theme is just so passionate, and it's such a driver of the story. But this is, as I understand it, this is actually a film from 2024 that's been adapted into, it's 4 parts on a BBC drama. It's in French, so it's subtitled. And I'm not much of a binge watcher, really. I tend to watch an episode and then come back to it another day. But I'm afraid I did just watch all 4 episodes in one sitting. And I was supposed to be doing the ironing, but obviously because it's subtitled, I couldn't really iron and watch it as well. So I'm afraid I also abandoned the ironing. So for me to do that for a TV programme, I think tells you it's really good. So massively beautiful backdrops and scenery, and just brilliant, being on the ship and things like that. Just
give us a quick synopsis.
Without spoilers.
Yeah, without spoilers.
Yeah, so young sailor thinks he's kind of hit the jackpot when he goes home to marry his childhood sweetheart, but then he is betrayed, ends up in prison, has to find a way out, which he does after a long time, and then wants to pay back the people who effectively put him there by betraying him.
And this is set in France.
Yeah, Marseille and Paris, and yeah.
In what sort?
What time? I don't
1700s.
Yeah, I would say maybe 1800s.
No, it's more the early 19th century.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But the costumes, the lighting, it's just stunning. So that's my Culture Club recommendation.
Good. Did you have something to bring, Frank?
Well, the thing that has really grabbed me more than anything is also on television. It's in Paramount. So basically, this is a series, 6-part series called Madison, after a river in Montana, and it's a story basically of a woman, a wife, whose husband has died in an airplane crash in Montana, who goes to Montana to try to discover what it was that made her husband love that part of the world so much. And it's a very intense, very beautifully done story that explores the whole family reaction to the father's death, but also through getting people in the family to go back to the place where he died and go to the cottage where he lived. They kind of go on a voyage of discovery where they learn a lot, not just about who that man was, what was it about Montana that he liked, but also about themselves. And there's that kind of redemptive element to the story. But it's all really beautifully observed. And I find it absolutely, sort of fantastic that you can still have, sort of dramas that have really good actors, but also tell a story that is so memorable that even weeks afterwards, you still talked about that program with the person that you watched it with.
Well, we will put a link to that in the show notes, and to the Count of Monte Cristo, and to Frank's book as well, which I am very much looking forward to as holiday reading. I'm going on holiday next week, so I found space for that in my suitcase.
Very good. Brilliant.
So thanks very much, Frank. That was really fantastic discussion. Really enjoyed it. And thanks everybody for listening. As always, please recommend us to your friends, and we'll see you again next time.
Pleasure talking to you. All the best.
Thank you.